The state of Hindus in the United States as it relates to civil rights and well-being in 3 parts. First, we'll start with the positive, because I'm generally an optimist. I like to think of positive things rather than negative. So we'll talk about flourishing, and that's in terms of the successes of the Hindu American community. Then we'll talk about challenges. What are the Hindu American communities facing in the United States, but more broadly in the diaspora? And because I'm positive, because I'm an optimist, we'll end with opportunities. So let's start with flourishing. On the whole, in a diverse, secular, and pluralistic country, and a democracy at that, with religious liberty as a fundamental right, Hindus in the United States have fared well. So that's the good news. So how have we fared? First, let's talk a little bit about a snapshot of the Hindu American community. If you can tell by my accent, I was born and raised in America. My father is from Kapadwanj. Anyone here from Kapadwanj? Roots in Kapadwanj? No. How about Jalod? Oh, there's someone maybe who has some roots in Jalod. My mother is from Jalod. My father left in 1964. He moved to to the United States to pursue his master's in chemical engineering. So just like many of you, તમે બધા વિચારો છો કે અમેરિકા જવું છે ભણવા, એ રીતના મારા પપ્પાને પણ વિચાર આવ્યો હતો કે મારે અમેરિકા જવું છે. 1964, you're not that far away from independence, so the infrastructure in India is very different than what you know it today, right? I don't know when the IITs were established, but was Indus, what year was Indus established in? 2004, so no Indus University, 1964. He travels to America. Why 1964? Why not before then? There were Chinese, there were Japanese, there were Europeans going to the United States, but around the 1920s, and there were also Indians who went. We all know Swami Vivekananda went in the late 1800s, right? 1880s, 1890s. The reason is that the United States passed a law called the Asian Exclusion Act. They barred any entry of anyone from Asia to come. They were okay with Europeans coming, but they didn't want the dirty Hindus coming into the country. They didn't want the dirty Chinese coming into the country. So it was racist policies that kept immigration stalled. In the 1960s, the United States also had a huge reckoning within the country. For over 200 years, slavery had been a problem in the United States. The United States economy was started on slavery. Slaves were bought and sold, human beings were bought and sold from Africa, taken to America, and used as slave labor. They were beaten, they were not paid, they were not fed right, their families were split apart. And even though slavery was abolished after the Civil War, the discriminatory laws that treated people of African origin as subhuman were still in place. But in 1965, we had our civil rights movement, where finally all people, regardless of the color of their skin, were given equal rights. They could now vote, they could now walk on the same streets legally. Doesn't mean socially it all happened. At one point, blacks in the United States would have to drink from a separate water fountain. They would have to eat at separate counters in restaurants. They had to sit at the back of the bus. That's the type of discriminatory laws that were in place in the United States. So 1965, the Civil Rights Act is passed. Alongside that, the Immigration Act is also passed. One of the things that happens there is that the Asian Exclusion Act is nullified. And they change the immigration priorities to allow for high-skilled workers. Now I want you to remember that. What's a high-skilled worker? It's someone who's maybe has a STEM background. How many of you are studying in STEM? Science, technology, engineering, medicine. Raise your hand. How many engineering students? Most of you. All of you. Okay. Any exceptions? Did I miss anyone who's not an engineering student? Okay. So you're the E in STEM, right? The United States wants to launch the space program. They know that their infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. And so they open up their immigration. And that's what allows for the Indian community in the United States going from just a few hundred to now today 5 million. So let me talk a little bit about that, the immigration. So in 1980, I was born in 71, right? So for the early parts of my life, I would very rarely meet other Indian people. If we met them, we would invite them over for cha nasto because it was so rare. And you want to be, especially for my parents, they want to be with people that understand them culturally. So in 1980, the population is 400,000. Today, it's 5 million. 5 million people of Indian origin live in the United States. Now, not all of them are Hindu. The census does not collect religious information. It only collects ethnic or national origin information, race, gender, household income, those types of things. But it does not collect religious. So anytime we talk about Hindu as opposed to Indian, because of course not all Indians are Hindu. We have Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, Parsis, or Zoroastrians. When we talk about Hindus, we have to extrapolate those numbers. So there's a few surveys that are out. There's one institution called the Pew Foundation. They estimate that 1% of the American population, and the American population is roughly about 330 million, 1% of the population is Hindu. There's another study by the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. They say 54% of the Asian origin are Hindu. Then you can also look at Indian statistics, right? And roughly we're about 79%. So then the range of Hindus are 2.3 million to about 3.5 million. Now that doesn't account for people who are Hindu who are not of Indian origin. Because of things like yoga or Hare Krishna, art of living, a number of other sampradayas that have become global, there are a number of people who identify as Hindu who are of European descent. So those are kind of our rough estimates. So let's talk a little bit about education and income. So in a matter of, so I talked about 1964, 1965, and now we're in 2024. So that's what, about roughly, you guys do the math, how many years? 1964 to 2024, right? So in that time, Indian population has the highest per household income. That's what skill-based labor contributes to. That when you have people who can only be allowed into the community or into the country because they have some sort of high skill, they're either coming in for a master's degree or they already have a master's degree and they're coming in for a PhD, and then they stay on, you're getting the cream of the crop. And that does fuel into this success story. So does the work ethic, of course, and the sheer intellectual power of the Indian American community. So where have we seen major success? And just so you see, 77%, that's a reflection of that, right? 77% have a bachelor's degree and 48% have a postgraduate degree. That is a highly educated population. Where have we seen success? Medicine, STEM, the hospitality industry, meaning hotels, motels, and entrepreneurship. So you have to keep in mind the immigration policies and how that shapes a community. Let's talk a little bit about religious identity. So I talked a little bit about how we don't have exact numbers, but what we do know is that people hold on to their tradition, and why not? We come from an ancient tradition And we come from a philosophy that has attracted people from across the globe to come to India for thousands of years. Not necessarily, I mean, some came for war, but many came just for intellectual insights because our spiritual heritage is that well known. And our heritage is even now so popular, whether it's the popularity of yoga, the popularity of the Bhagavad Gita, these are household names around the world. So people that are born into the tradition are very proud of it, and they do hold on to it. 91% of Hindus end up marrying other Hindus, and there are at least 900, close to 1,000 mandirs throughout the United States. And I'll just point out some of these statistics. 80% of born Hindus adhere to it, so you don't have much conversion out. You might have people who are kind of ambivalent, ke chalo puja nathi karvi, mandire nathi jau, Diwali nathi ujvi. You might have those types of folks there, right? But generally speaking, those people who are born into Hindu families remain Hindu. 10% have converted in. These are the folks I was talking about that don't get accounted for in that 1% or that 3.5 or 4 million. They're people who, in fact, at Hindu American Foundation, many of our staff members are, and they self-identify as white Hindus. What does that mean? That maybe in high school or college they went into a used bookstore and they bumped into the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhams Yogananda, or a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. They read it and said, this is what makes sense to me. This is what defines my worldview. And then they slowly do deeper and deeper study and now identify as Hindu. 18% identify as non-affiliated, agnostic or atheist, those two that I talked about. 2%, only 2% convert out. So on the whole, that to me is a success, that people hold on to the traditions. One of the things that contributes to this is that the United States has religious freedom built into the US Constitution. And it's two-pronged: free exercise and establishment clause. I'm going to explain what both of those mean. Free exercise means that the government cannot interfere in the practice of religion. They cannot regulate what happens in a mandir. They cannot regulate what you do in your home, unless you're breaking some criminal law. And establishment clause means that the government cannot show preference towards any one religion. So when you have this two-pronged constitutional guarantee, it contributes to an environment where people can freely be who they are. I also want to just mention that, I talked about all the other diasporas. One diaspora I didn't mention is the Caribbean diaspora. How many of you, by a show of hands, know that there are Hindus in Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Suriname? Raise your hands if you knew that. It's okay if you don't. So how did Indians get to these islands? Well, when slavery was abolished, the British and the Europeans still needed free labor. So what did they do? They went into their own backyard because India was under British rule. And they took Indians, promising them that they would be taken and brought back. And they took them as indentured servants. They signed contracts that said that you come with us, but then you owe us the debt of us taking you to the Caribbean islands. And there they were working in sugar plantations, sherdi, right? Cutting sherdi, then also cotton. But these contracts were so one-sided that you could never buy back your freedom. And so Indians were also part of the global slavery story, because indentured servitude is basically it's slavery in sheep's clothing. So many Hindus were taken, and Indians meaning Muslim, Christian, well, not as many Christians, but Muslims and Jains and Hindus were taken to the islands as indentured servants. Those Indians are now 4 generations out, but they have still preserved Sanatan Dharma there. And there's many from the Caribbean islands that are now in the United States. So why did I start with success? Because when things are good, you basically have blinders on because things are great, you're looking forward. What you don't realize is that there's challenges coming at you. You put blinders on your peripheral vision and you miss out on what might be coming your way. Success also breeds complacency, or success actually invites attacks, because when you are 1% of a population, and in America we have a phrase, punching above your weight. It means you are showing the country that even though you're this tiny, you're giving back in tenfold, hundredfold. You are working well beyond your capacity. Well, that can contribute to jealousy, greed, envy, right? People feel that, oh, who are these Indians coming and taking our jobs? So that can also bring challenges. So it's kind of a two-sided coin. So when I talk about challenges, I'm going to talk again about 3: long-standing challenges, urgent crises, and also existential crises. So let's talk about some of the long-standing. So some of the long-standing challenges that we face as a community are ones that many of you might be familiar with, or you'll become familiar with as you take more classes through the Indic Studies department. So whether it's our cosmology or caste, most of what the Western Academy knows or says or talks about in terms of our culture and our civilizational ethos, and in turn what the Western media says. Ramji mentioned New York Times, Washington Post. Yes, I've been featured in them, but not always positively for a reason. But especially what I call legacy media. That's BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, kind of those old standards that used to be known as the single most influential sources of news. They regurgitate about us and our way of, what they regurgitate about us and our way of life is more a reflection of their inaccurate and biased views rather than how we know ourselves to be, right? So this is a long-standing challenge. Why? Because most of what the world knows about us today is rooted in what the British said we were. And do you think the British had much positive to say about us? Probably not. Why? Because they have to justify why they were in control for so long. They have to justify why they were stealing all of our natural resources and then taxing us to have to rebuy those products, right? So where does this impact? Where are those negative stories about Sanatan Dharma, about Indian history, about the Indian people, where does that emerge? And when I talk about negative, let me just give you some examples so you can envision. When American students learn about India for the first time, even today, very often they will ask the question, is there electricity in India? Do people still live in trees? Do you eat monkey brains? These are the types of stereotypes that exist in the popular media as well as in textbooks. They teach about India and the Indian culture even today in very negative, rudimentary, primitive terms. And so that has an impact not only on my own children growing up in that country, and even me. I used to get teased all the time about being Indian. People would ask, oh, are your parents saving up for your dowry? Is your marriage going to be arranged? Like all of these stereotypes that they had in their head about Indians, right? So there's an actual impact. It's not just something that's frozen in a book. It affects people. Because then it would have been just as easy for me to say, you know what? This being Indian is too much baggage. I don't want to be Indian. Yes, my skin or my name or everything, people will think that, but let me try to blend in and be as Americanized as possible. Let me forget my matrubhasha. Let me forget garba. Let me forget that we happen to be vegetarian. But, so that's the type of impact it can have on your identity. Children get bullied, and then it can also lead into discrimination in the workplace. So there is a real world impact to these negative perceptions and negative narratives. Now, what happens is, in the United States, anywhere from 5th grade to 11th grade, you learn about India. And what is taught about India is very often mandated by the state. And I think school curricula here are mandated by the state. So that's similar to how things are here. What we found with the way that states like California, which has the largest population, one of the largest population of Indian Americans and Hindu Americans, there they mandate about 5 things to teach about India. Talk about the Aryan invasion theory, talk about the Hindu caste system, talk about, I think, maybe the arrival of Ashoka or Buddhism, and then a few other things related to geography. So what we found, we did a survey at the Hindu American Foundation. We surveyed 300 Hindu American students. Half of those surveyed indicated feelings of awkwardness or social isolation because of their religious identity. 1/3 of those said that they had been bullied because of their religious beliefs. The Carnegie Endowment Study, which I mentioned earlier, found that 50% of Indian Americans reported experiencing some kind of discrimination in the past year. And then there's, of course, more serious issues that arise as a result of people just having a negative view towards Hindu Americans. They range from murder to temple robberies and vandalism. And oftentimes law enforcement is unable to recognize when something might be a religiously motivated hate crime because they are unfamiliar with or ignorant about Hinduism or of Indian culture. In 2014, Pew did a survey, and Hindu Americans were not regarded warmly, not as warmly as Jewish people, Catholics, evangelicals, and Buddhists. So there's an impact to these negative portrayals. Just to point out, because we'll be talking about it later, this pyramid, right? Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. This is what Indian society is reduced to, as if this is how Indian society has always been and continues to be, where you have a small group of people who have all the political, economic, and social power, and then they subjugate the rest. And you'll see how those stereotypes kind of play into policy. So how do you counter these types of long-standing issues? One of the things that we do at the Hindu American Foundation is that we educate the public about Sanatan Dharma, about ancient Indian history. And we've been doing this since 2003. So we have core content on ancient Indian history, and we're going to be doing modern history, but also on Indian philosophy. So that would include Hindu Dharma traditions, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh traditions, as well as Zoroastrianism. And we take this core content and we go into the public school system. Teachers might be mandated by the state to teach about a topic in a particular way, but if they see that there's a negative impact on their students, they don't want to do that. Teachers are in the field because they want to educate. And so they're very open to our materials. So we've trained about 4,000 public school teachers. That's an impact of about 100,000 students per year, and we're looking to scale that program. But this way, we say, this is what the state mandates. Here's what the state says about India and how it's incorrect. Here is the correct information. Knowledge is an antidote to many of our challenges. And so that's why we've taken the approach of educating. We also educate law enforcement officers. We also do education in the corporate sector, so that if any of you pursue your higher education in America, or you just go straight from here to work there, we need to make sure that corporate America has an understanding of who we are and that they treat you with respect. The other side of that is that we also need to know what are our obligations. Rights is not a one-sided coin. It's a two-sided coin. Yes, we have certain rights, but we also have responsibilities. how do we need to treat one another in the corporate sector? How should we be treating one another in school settings is also the type of education we do, and that's called our Know Your Rights education. So we're educating the community, and we're educating the external mainstream world so that there's kind of a convergence where both sides know what their rights and responsibilities are to one another. And I think this is where our civilizational ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is so powerful. And even Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti, right? That the truth is one, the paths are many. And Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, meaning that the world is one family. It's in our blood to know that we should treat one another with respect. It's in our DNA to think that there's not just one way of doing things. When you have that inbuilt openness and flexibility, you can succeed anywhere in the world. And I think that's also, yes, immigration policy is a piece of our success story, but so is our civilizational ethos. We can go anywhere and help others. We can make sure that we're supporting our families, and we can transcend differences as a result of this ethos. And sometimes I think that when we're in India, it's hard to remember that. There's something about moving away that allows you to recognize how is it that over 1 billion people can function. Even just look at the way traffic is. Somehow, with all the cars, even if there's a traffic jam, there's always someone who gets up out of their car and says, okay, I'm going to work here. They have no reason to have to get out of their car and help other people, but they'll do it. There's something special about our civilizational ethos that allows, as chaotic as things are here, for things to function, but for also us to succeed when we leave. So what are some of the other challenges? So you have the narrative issue. And even though I talked about establishment clause, meaning that the government cannot support one particular religion, there is still what I would call Christian normativity. The vast majority of Americans are Christian, right? That's a reality. So when you have religious freedom, what that means is that the US government cannot fund any religion. It's a little bit different here in India, right? Hindu temples, for instance, are not out of the control of the government, but other institutions are. That's not allowed in the United States. Yet still, because many of the policymakers are Christian, they might try to sneak in different laws, different things that would promote Christianity. So for instance, recently one state mandated that the 10 Commandments be displayed in every public school. Now, is there anything wrong with that? No, sure. If the 10 Commandments are teaching something good, fine. But then would you allow, say, a poster of the Yama and Niyama from yoga to be posted? Would you allow the 8 Noble Truths of Buddhism to be posted? I'm fairly certain that those legislators don't want that. They only want Christianity. So there's ways in which groups like the Hindu American Foundation join other groups, including Christian groups, who say the healthiest formula is for the government to stay out of religion and for religion to stay out of government. That is what the American definition of secular democracy is. So these are the types of things that we will oppose through advocacy. That means we go and meet with members of the government to say, we oppose this. We don't want you to vote for this legislation because it will have a bad impact on our community, or that it's against the US Constitution. Or we also file public interest lawsuits when things like this happen. One other issue that's come up recently, and this is the last one in terms of kind of long-standing challenges, and that is the swastika. Now here, we see swastikas everywhere, on a car, at the store, in a rangoli, anywhere, right? Everywhere. But in the United States, what's happened is that our swastik is confused with the Nazi symbol, right? So many lawmakers, because they're ignorant, they only associate that symbol with Nazism. Many lawmakers have tried to pass laws to ban the swastik. Now, how would we do our puja if you are not allowed to draw that? Now, they wouldn't be able to come into a mandir to stop that. So that's kind of an exaggerated example. But certainly, if you have a car and you do a vahan puja and you have a swastik on it, if it's banned in public places, you would have difficulty doing that, right? Children, if they have a swastik pendant, they might get in trouble for wearing it at school. So we've taken this as an opportunity to educate. We go to lawmakers and say, the swastik is an ancient symbol, not to be confused with the Nazi emblem or the Hakenkreuz, and it is very much central to our religious practices. So you cannot just ban this symbol. So that's another example of how you can advocate when you are facing these types of long-standing challenges. Part of this we also did for the swastik, we also created a guide in partnership with the Jewish community. Now, the reason that was important was that for the Jewish community, it's obviously very sensitive because in World War II, they faced such grave atrocities because of Nazism. So it's a way of bridging understanding with a community that otherwise would be opposing you. So that's one example of how you can also, just because we're the Hindu American Foundation, doesn't mean that we just support Hindus or work with just Hindus. We work with everyone. And that's also very much a part of our tradition, is to not divide, at least philosophically, to not divide one another on that basis. So let's talk a little bit about urgent crises. I'm going to take a sip of water. So, Sharmaji, he mentioned the topic of caste. Now, the realities there are very different than the realities here. In the United States, we have what's called the Equal Protection Clause in our US Constitution. What that means is that everyone must be treated equally, full stop. Doesn't matter what your background is, doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, doesn't matter what color your skin is, doesn't matter what your gender is. Everyone must be protected equally. Everyone has the same laws. That's different from the legal structure here. What that means then is that we have what's called non-discrimination laws. And the non-discrimination laws, whether it's in the workplace or in schools, say that if you have been discriminated against on the basis of your ancestry or your background, your race, color of skin, gender, and even age, then you are protected from that. You can either file a complaint, you can file a lawsuit, you can make sure you don't get fired, or if you've been denied a promotion, you can make sure that that doesn't happen. So these laws are there to protect you. So when we talk about the weaponization of caste, it's that even though ancestry is already covered in the laws, they have added caste. Now when I talk about they, who am I talking about? I'm talking about certain activists who are anti-Hindu. They know, right? We started with narratives. We started talking about how India and Hindu culture is always presented in negative terms. That we have this pyramid where there's the group of Brahmins who subjugate everyone else, right? So that's already in the average American mind. Then you have these activists that are pushing for these types of things. They have concocted surveys in which they claim that there's widespread caste discrimination. The reality is it's minimal. And I'm going to read some statistics that have been done by the Carnegie Endowment. So 47% of respondents to that survey identify with a caste, right? So that means that the majority, 53%, don't. Now that in and of itself, just because you have some association, some affiliation with your ancestral community, does not mean that you're necessarily discriminating on that basis. 53% said that they don't identify with one. Now there's also a breakdown between who has come from India, like say my parents, or anyone who born here and then goes there to pursue education, and versus others like me, born and raised there. So 53% of those 47 that identify with a caste group, 53% of foreign-born Hindu Indian Americans affiliate with a caste group, and 34% of US-born Hindu Americans do. So that leaves, 66% that don't. In fact, I had never even heard of the word caste. In 9th grade, in my world history class, when we learned about India, they showed the pyramid. And my teacher said, "Where are you on this pyramid?" And I said, "I have no idea. I was just raised in a Hindu household, never any talk about what our jnati is or anything like that." So then she assigned it to me as homework. So there is a white American teacher inserting caste consciousness into a young Indian American. I was the only Indian in my class of 30, right? So these are the types of things where most don't even know what their background is. What the addition of a term like caste does is that it gives the idea to corporate America or to these colleges that Indians are somehow so different, they are so internally bigoted or prejudiced that they need separate laws to regulate their behavior. Of course, we're against any sort of discrimination on the basis of someone's ancestral backgrounds. But if ancestry is already covered, and the term ancestry doesn't single out any one community, it applies to everyone. But when you talk about just caste, the entire world, if you go and do a survey, I can guarantee, if you say which country has caste, how many of you think that they would only have one answer? India. Raise your hands if you think that would be their answer. You think it's going to be their answer. What other country is associated with caste? You can raise your hand or call out countries. Any other country that caste is associated with? None, right? So when you add this to policy, there's only one community you're talking about, and that's Indian people. So what does that do? We talked about our successes. If a corporation has a choice between hiring you versus hiring maybe someone from China, who are they going to prefer? Right? These policies, what happens is oftentimes in our community, people say, well, we're not discriminating on the basis of caste. Who cares? Well, you should care because when it comes time for the next generation to get hired, and a corporation has said, well, Indians are special, unique, that we have to have special laws to police them, well, it's going to affect your hireability. It's going to affect your ability to thrive in college or in a corporation. So these are the types of laws that we've been fighting. The state of California tried to pass this. First, it was just at the college policy level and corporation policy level. California last year tried to pass it at the state level, but the community got together and we fought against it and we won. So they were not successful in being able to pass this. So that talks a little bit about the law in California. So the last kind of, so this is not an urgent crisis. Let me talk a little bit about weaponizing of Hindutva. So I'm going to take another survey by hands. How many of you think Hindutva has one definition? Raise your hand. How about two? Two definitions. How about multiple? Raise your hand. Hi, be confident. Right. Good, thank you. So here is a word that has multiple meanings. It has a long history, and some people may espouse a particular meaning. Some organizations overtly espouse this word, and many don't even know what it means. But what I mean by weaponizing Hindutva is that the media in the United States and many of the NGOs that were behind the caste laws, trying to push caste into corporate policies, they have been behind weaponizing this term. So what do they do by that? They say that there's no difference between Hindu and Hindutva. Now, if you say that, then your average mandir is Hindutva, a Hindu American Foundation, they say, is Hindutva. Whatever other organization, Chinmaya Mission or whatever, BAPS, Swaminarayan, that they are Hindutva. How do they define Hindutva? They define Hindutva as anti-everyone else. Not as something that maybe says that, that India's core civilizational ethos comes from Sanatan Dharma, or the variety of other more positive definitions of Hindutva, but they only define it as that. So what happens then is that for those of us who live there, they say that, well, they're not really American. They're foreigners who espouse this very dangerous ideology. We have to be careful of them. They are anti all these other religious groups. We should exclude them from our task forces. We should exclude them from any interfaith fora. And so where Hindus can positively contribute with ideas of ahimsa, of ideas of ekam sat or vasudhaiva kutumbakam, we can't get in the door. The other thing that happens, that's a picture of an Indian congressman. Now, only in the last 10 years have Indians risen in politics. So we've seen tremendous success in science, technology, entrepreneurship, medicine, hospitality, all of those things. But where we were not as visible was in politics. So now we have 5 congressmen and women of Indian origin in the US Congress. So what very often happens when they're running in elections is, instead of looking at what, say, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy has done for his constituents in Chicago, his opponent will say, oh, don't vote for him, he's Hindutva, even though he has nothing to do with it. So it puts him in a defensive mode. So this is another issue that we run into. And then the targeting of Hindu students with the same thing. There are a set of professors, they're mostly in the humanities, unfortunately. They're not in engineering, so that's good. But they will target Hindu students with the same thing. They'll say, watch out for Hindu students on campus. They might be espousing this Hindutva ideology. And if they're doing that, then all the other students who are of Indian origin but of other minority religions might be in danger. So again, what does that do? It negatively puts a negative view towards us on college campuses. And those are just some images. So I'll quickly talk about existential crises, so then we can go to questions and answers. And this is really kind of more a broad issue, and that is, what is happening to Hindus around the world? So when you look at places like Bangladesh, when you look at places like Pakistan, you have communities of Hindus that have basically been wiped out. You have percentages that were in the teens now to below 5. But what happens is that when you're in the spaces, whether it's NGOs or whether it's government conversations about human rights, there's a human rights denial of what's happening. So things like the Citizenship Amendment Act, when that was passed here, to say that Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians and Sikhs who are suffering in any of these countries, in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, or Pakistan, that they can, if they arrived into the country before, I think it was 2014, that there will be a pathway to citizenship. All of those laws, and you probably saw the media reports here, how those people who are active in this anti-Hindu activism wanted to portray that as something that was anti-minority, and denying the fact that Hindus suffer in some of these regimes. So you see that sort of denial. When you see that sort of denial, when Hindus are in distress and need assistance, it's difficult to get the government support to get them to come and do that. So what we've been doing at the Hindu American Foundation is publishing a human rights report for almost 15 years. And now we've archived those reports and have more country-specific pages. And so when it was the 30th anniversary of the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide, we had a special landing page to draw awareness, because people don't even know that this happened. It would be 50th, not 30th, 50th anniversary. So these are the ways in which we educate. Why is education on human rights important? Because the only way to ensure that human rights atrocities don't happen in the future is to remember the toll that they took in the past. So what happens when we have challenges? Well, we have opportunities. And I go back to our civilizational ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, of so many of the things that yoga offers in terms of being able to calm the mind, to remember what's important in life. We're seeing that across the globe, things like social media are contributing to polarization and division. But our traditional practices have a lot to offer, and that's why it's important that when we have these challenges, we have to stand up and oppose them, but also not forget what it is that we're fighting for. So whether it's doing some sort of karma yoga seva, doing some sort of charitable work, making a new friend with someone who maybe is isolated at your school or people don't talk to, showing kindness. These are the powerful ways that we can continue to show the world what we have to offer. Thank you.